This week, California crossed a line it can't come back from. A critical refinery that's been quietly keeping the state's fuel system alive just announced it's shutting down for good. And the response from Sacramento? Desperate phone calls, emergency meetings, and a scramble to find fuel from anywhere, at any cost. If you think filling your tank hurts now, what I'm about to show you will explain why it's only going to get worse. I'm Lawson, and before we get into this, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with anyone who's tired of watching their paycheck evaporate at the pump. Because what's unfolding in California right now is a case study in how good intentions collide with economic reality and how ordinary people always pay the price. Let's break down what just happened. A major refining facility, one of the last large-scale operations still running in California, has officially announced permanent closure. We're not talking about a temporary shutdown or seasonal maintenance. This is tens of thousands of barrels per day of gasoline production vanishing from the supply chain, and it's not coming back. To understand why this matters, you need to know how fragile California's fuel system really is. The state consumes somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 barrels of gasoline every single day. This refinery alone was responsible for nearly 10% of that supply. In most states, losing 10% of production would be painful. In California, it's catastrophic. Here's why. California doesn't operate like the rest of the country when it comes to fuel. There are no pipelines connecting California to the massive refining complexes in Texas or the Gulf Coast. You can't just flip a switch and truck in fuel from neighboring states. California's gasoline is unique. It has to meet stricter environmental formulations that only a handful of refineries in the world can produce. So when local production disappears, you can't replace it easily. You're stuck importing specialty fuel from overseas, and that takes time, money, and a whole lot of luck. Now, let's talk about how we got here. This refinery didn't close because business was bad. Demand for gasoline in California is still strong. People are commuting, freight is moving, tourism is up. The problem isn't demand. The problem is that running a refinery in California has become a financial nightmare. Over the last decade, the state has piled on layer after layer of regulations, low-carbon fuel standards that require expensive credits, cap and trade compliance that adds real costs to every gallon, emissions rules that demand constant costly upgrades, mandates to produce specific fuel blends that require specialized equipment, and on top of all that, a political environment that openly says gasoline has no future here. If you're a company looking at that situation, the math is simple. Refineries require billions in capital investment. They're long-term assets. But when the state government tells you they want to phase out your product within 10 or 15 years, why would you invest another dollar? You wouldn't. And that's exactly what's been happening. Back in the 1980s, California had over 30 operating refineries. Today, there are fewer than 15. And now, with this latest closure, that number just dropped again. These aren't random shutdowns. This is a slow-motion collapse of California's fuel infrastructure, and now the governor's office is in full crisis mode. According to reports, state officials have been working the phones, reaching out to regulators, energy agencies, and international suppliers. They're floating emergency waivers. They're talking about monitoring markets and protecting consumers. But here's the hard truth nobody in Sacramento wants to say out loud. Once a refinery closes, it's over. You can't bring it back online in a few weeks. You can't magically conjure up tens of thousands of barrels per day. The only option left is to import fuel, and that comes with its own set of problems. California will now have to rely even more heavily on foreign refineries, mostly in Asia, places like South Korea, Japan, and India. These facilities can produce the specialized gasoline California requires, but getting it here isn't simple. Tankers take 30 to 40 days to cross the Pacific. They burn heavy fuel oil the entire way, which ironically increases global emissions. Shipping costs get tacked onto every gallon. And if there's any disruption, weather, port congestion, Geopolitical tension, California feels it immediately. This is how California becomes completely dependent on imports, a fuel island with no safety net. Let's pause for a second and appreciate the irony. California's environmental policies were designed to reduce emissions and move away from fossil fuels, but shutting down refineries doesn't eliminate the need for gasoline overnight. What it does is push production to countries with looser environmental standards, then ship that fuel thousands of miles across the ocean. That doesn't reduce emissions, it increases them, and Californians pay more for the privilege. Now let's talk about what this means for your wallet. Before this closure, California was already paying $1.30 to $1.60 more per gallon than the national average. That gap exists because of state taxes, regulations, and supply constraints. With this refinery now offline, energy analysts are projecting wholesale gasoline prices in California could jump by 20 to 40 cents per gallon almost immediately. At the retail level, you're looking at an extra 30 to 60 cents per gallon once stations adjust. Let me put that in real terms. If you drive 15,000 miles a year and your car gets 25 miles per gallon, that's 600 gallons annually. An extra 50 cents per gallon is $300 more per year just from this one shutdown. For families with long commutes, multiple vehicles, or trucks, it's worse. And this isn't just a Northern California problem. California's fuel markets are interconnected. When one region scrambles for imports, it competes with other regions for supply. That tightens the market statewide. Prices rise in Los Angeles, San Diego, and even neighboring states like Arizona and Nevada that depend on California refineries for part of their fuel. One closure creates a ripple effect across the entire Southwest. And here's the bigger pattern you need to see. This didn't start this week. For years, refinery operators have been warning regulators that continued operation was becoming unsustainable. Some reduced capacity, others delayed critical maintenance. A few converted parts of their operations to renewable diesel, not because the market demanded it, but because policy incentives pushed them in that direction. Each step reduced gasoline output a little more, and each time, prices crept higher. In 2015, California's average gas price was about 30 to 40 cents above the national average. By 2022, that gap regularly exceeded $1.50. In recent years, Californians have paid an extra $800 to $2,200 per household per year just for gasoline compared to the rest of the country. Those aren't abstract statistics. That's grocery money, that's rent, that's childcare, that's real money coming out of real pockets. Truckers feel it first, then small businesses, then it shows up in food prices, delivery fees, and the cost of everything you buy. And here's what rarely gets said honestly in public. None of this requires villains or conspiracies. This is basic economics. When you make it harder and more expensive to produce something, supply shrinks. When demand stays relatively stable, as it does in a car-dependent state, prices go up. When you eliminate local production, you import at a higher cost. That cost flows directly to the consumer. No bad actors required, just policy meeting reality. Now, some officials argue this is temporary pain, that electric vehicles will replace gasoline demand soon enough, that refinery closures are part of a necessary transition. But here's the problem with that argument. Transitions only work if infrastructure keeps pace. Right now, California still has millions of gasoline-powered vehicles on the road. EV adoption is growing, yes, but not nearly fast enough to offset the loss of refining capacity. Charging infrastructure is inconsistent. Electricity prices in California are among the highest in the nation, and heavy-duty trucking, aviation, agriculture, emergency services, they all still run on liquid fuels. You can't wish that reality away with press releases and hopeful projections. When a refinery closes before demand actually disappears, you create a supply gap, and that gap gets filled by imports. That's exactly what's happening now. California already imports roughly 200,000 barrels per day of gasoline and blending components. With this refinery offline, that number is expected to spike, especially during peak summer demand. every additional barrel of imported fuel costs more than locally refined gasoline. Shipping alone can add 10 to 20 cents per gallon. Add in tighter global markets, and prices climb even higher. And remember, California has no cushion. There are no massive storage facilities. Inventories are typically just a few weeks' worth of supply. When something goes wrong, prices react instantly. That's why California sees price spikes that other states don't. There's no buffer, no backup plan. Now let's talk about the governor's position. He's caught between competing forces. Environmental groups want faster fossil fuel phase-outs. Voters are furious about gas prices. Businesses are warning about competitiveness. Regulators are enforcing the rules as written. So, when this refinery announced its closure, the response wasn't celebration, it was panic. Behind closed doors, officials understand what this means. They know imports are coming. They know prices will spike. They know that blaming oil companies for price gouging won't fix a supply shortage. But publicly admitting that policy decisions contributed to this crisis is politically toxic. So instead, you hear vague phrases like unforeseen challenges and market disruptions. But here's the reality. Even if another facility somehow picks up some of the slack, the signal has been sent. Operating a refinery in California is risky and unprofitable. Capital will continue to leave. Future investments will go elsewhere. And each closure makes the next one more painful. This is what energy economists call a tipping point. Once a region loses enough refining capacity, it becomes permanently dependent on imports. Rebuilding that capacity later is nearly impossible. No company is going to invest billions to build a new gasoline refinery in a state that's openly hostile to the product. At that point, high prices become the new normal, forever. And that's the path California is on right now. For drivers, this means volatility is the new reality. A refinery fire, a maintenance issue, a storm on the other side of the planet, any of these can add 50 cents or more per gallon overnight. For businesses, it means constant uncertainty. For families, it means budgets stretched even thinner. And for policymakers in other states, it's a warning. They're watching California closely. They're seeing what happens when supply is treated as an afterthought. They're seeing the consequences of ignoring infrastructure while promising affordability. Because at the end of the day, gasoline prices aren't set by speeches or press conferences. They're set by barrels, tankers, pipelines, and refineries. You can regulate those out of existence, but you cannot regulate demand away overnight. So where does this leave us? In the short term, expect higher prices. Expect more imports. Expect officials to scramble every time something breaks. In the long term, the only question is whether anyone in power is willing to admit that shrinking supply before alternatives are fully ready has real costs and real consequences. Because right now, those consequences are being paid by drivers, workers, families, and small businesses. They didn't choose to become a fuel island, but they're being forced to live like one. If this breakdown opened your eyes, subscribe for more in-depth coverage of energy policy, fuel markets, and the decisions shaping your daily life. Drop a comment with what gas prices look like in your area, and share this video with someone who needs to understand why their fill-up just got a lot more expensive. Because this story is far from over, and the price at the pump hasn't finished climbing yet.